The flames flickered in the dimly lit prison cell, casting shadows on the cold stone walls. Heavy chains bound his wrists, a painful reminder of the fate that awaited him. Peter, once a fisherman, now a prisoner of Rome, knew his time was near. But how would it happen? Would he face the same fate as his master, or would the cruelty of men devise an even darker end? What led Peter to this moment? How did a simple man from Galilee become the enemy of the empire? His journey was marked by faith and defiance, a path that turned a fisherman into a rock, but also made him a target. His unwavering belief in the resurrected Christ had sealed his destiny, yet the story of how he reached this point remained untold. Until now. Born as Simon in the humble town of Bethsaida, Peter's life was once simple. He spent his days casting nets into the sea, seeking the day's catch to feed his family. The waters of Galilee had been his world, a place of routine and survival. Yet something stirred within him, a longing for more, for meaning beyond the endless waves. Everything changed when he met Jesus. A single call, "Follow me," altered the course of his life forever. But this is not the story of his time at the Messiah's side. This is the story of what came after, when the echoes of his master's words still rang in his heart, but the world had grown hostile. Before we continue, take a moment to support this journey through history. If you're finding this story compelling, leave a like to help this content reach more people, subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes, and comment below which biblical figure you'd like to see in a future series. Your engagement helps keep these stories alive. In the years after Christ's ascension, Peter became the voice of the new faith, preaching in the streets, defying rulers, and standing before kings without fear. Yet, each step he took in the name of his Lord also brought him closer to the cross, his own cross. Now trapped in Rome, condemned to die, Peter faced the final chapter of his journey. But the true tragedy was not just his death. It was how it would happen, a fate so cruel that even the executioners hesitated. His end was near, yet the full horror of his martyrdom was yet to unfold. The air inside the dungeon was thick with the scent of damp stone and despair. The sounds of distant footsteps echoed through the halls, a reminder that time was slipping away. Peter, now aged and weary, had no illusions about his fate. He had seen too much, suffered too greatly to expect mercy from those who held him captive. Yet there was no fear in his heart. Only one thought consumed him. Had he done enough? Had he fulfilled his purpose? The story of his life had been one of transformation. He was no longer the impulsive fisherman who had once feared the raging storm. He had become the foundation of a movement, a shepherd to those who sought truth, a voice that could not be silenced. His words had ignited faith across nations, but they had also drawn the wrath of Rome. The emperor's decree was clear. Christians were a threat. They disrupted the order, defied the gods, and swore allegiance to a king Rome could not see. Nero, a ruler known for his cruelty, sought to make an example of them. And who better than Peter, the leader of this rebellious sect? Rumors had reached him even in his imprisonment. Some said that he would be torn apart by wild beasts, that the Colosseum would be his grave. Others whispered that he would be burned alive, a human torch to illuminate the emperor's gardens. But Peter knew the truth. He would die as his master had died, crucified. Still, there was one thing that weighed on him. The thought of facing the same death as Christ filled him with sorrow, not because he feared suffering, but because he felt unworthy. He was the man who had once denied Jesus, the disciple who had faltered when it mattered most. How could he, of all men, die in the same manner as the Lord? The decision was made. When the moment came, when the Roman soldiers dragged him to the place of execution, Peter would make one final request. If he was to be crucified, let it be upside down, not in arrogance, but in humility. If his life had been a journey toward redemption, then his death would be a testimony to the grace that had transformed him. The heavy iron door creaked open. The guards had come. It was time. The chains rattled as Peter was yanked to his feet. The guards, hardened by years of cruelty, had no sympathy for the old man before them. To them, he was nothing more than another criminal, another enemy of Rome. Yet, as they looked into his eyes, they saw no fear, only a quiet resolve, a peace that defied reason. They led him through the dark corridors of the prison, past other captives awaiting their own grim fates. Some whispered prayers as he passed, others turned away, unable to face the sight of the man who had been their leader, now reduced to a condemned prisoner. But Peter did not falter. His body ached from the beatings. His steps were slow, yet his spirit remained unbroken. The streets of Rome were eerily silent as they emerged from the prison gates. It was as if the city itself held its breath, watching as the apostle was marched toward his execution. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the blood-stained ground. Spectators had already begun to gather, eager to witness the spectacle. Peter had seen this before, how the crowds jeered, how they reveled in the suffering of the condemned. It was the same in Jerusalem, the same everywhere men chose cruelty over compassion. Yet, among the faces in the crowd, he also saw sorrow. There were those who had heard his words, who had come to believe in the message he carried. Their eyes glistened with tears, their hands clenched in helpless grief. The site of the execution was just ahead, a barren hill outside the city where criminals were put to death in the most brutal fashion. And there it stood, the wooden cross, waiting for him. A cruel irony, yet one he had already accepted. As the soldiers prepared for the gruesome task, Peter raised his voice, not to plead, but to make his final request. His words, though spoken softly, carried with them a weight that silenced even the crowd. "I am not worthy to die as my Lord did," he said. "Crucify me upside down." The executioners hesitated. This was not the usual request. But what did it matter? A dead man had no say in how he was to perish. And so they agreed. Peter did not resist as they bound his hands and feet, as they lifted him toward the sky, his head tilting downward, his final perspective of the world inverted. The pain was unbearable, the blood rushed to his head, but still, he prayed. Not for himself, but for those who did not yet believe. Even in death, his mission was not complete. The rough ropes cut into Peter's wrists and ankles as the soldiers hoisted the cross upright. His body, now suspended upside down, trembled under the weight of his own suffering. Blood rushed to his head, turning his vision into a blur of shifting colors and shadows. Each breath was a battle, each moment an eternity. Yet, even in the grip of agony, his lips moved, not in cries of despair, but in prayer. The crowd that had gathered to witness his execution was a mixture of emotions. Some watched with morbid curiosity, whispering among themselves about the strange request he had made. Others mocked him, laughing at the supposed leader of the Christians, now nothing more than another condemned soul. But there were also those who wept, those who had walked in the light of his teachings, who had found hope in his words, now forced to watch the brutal end of the man who had guided them. Among them, a young man with tear-filled eyes clutched a small wooden cross. He had once heard Peter preach about the love of Christ, about redemption and faith. Now, as he stood in the shadow of the apostle's suffering, he struggled to understand. How could such a man of righteousness, die in such a cruel manner? Peter's thoughts drifted to memories of the past, to the shores of Galilee where it had all begun. He could almost hear the waves crashing against the rocks, the scent of salt in the air. He remembered the moment Jesus called him, the moment he left everything behind to follow a path he did not yet understand. And now, here he was, at the end of that journey, embracing the final trial that would seal his place in eternity. The soldiers stood idly by, waiting for death to claim him. Unlike a traditional crucifixion where the body would succumb over days, being hung upside down would quicken the process. The blood pooling in his head would soon overwhelm his body, forcing his heart to falter. He could feel it already, the darkness creeping at the edges of his consciousness, the slow dimming of the world around him. A sudden gust of wind swept through the execution site, carrying with it the echoes of distant voices. Peter's heart swelled with peace. He knew the end was near, but he also knew that this was not truly the end. His time in this world was passing, but his faith, his message, would remain. The fire of Christ would not be extinguished, not by Rome, not by death. And so with his final strength, he whispered the last words that would ever leave his lips. "Lord, into your hands. I surrender my spirit." His vision faded. His body went still. And with that, the rock upon which the church had been built took his final breath. A hush fell over the crowd as Peter's body hung motionless from the cross. The mocking jeers had faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Even the most hardened among the spectators sensed that something profound had taken place. The leader of the Christians, the one who had defied emperors and stood firm in his faith, was now gone. But in his death, he had left behind something greater than himself, a legacy that could not be broken. The Roman soldiers, accustomed to carrying out executions without emotion, found themselves momentarily still. One of them, a grizzled veteran of many such deaths, glanced at his companion and muttered, "This one died differently." There was no struggle, no cries for mercy, only an unshakable resolve, a peace that defied the cruelty of his fate. As the sun began its descent behind the walls of Rome, Peter's followers, hidden among the crowd, exchanged solemn glances. They had known this day would come, yet the sight of their leader's lifeless form filled them with grief. Some of them had once doubted, just as Peter himself had. Some had wondered if their cause would survive in the face of persecution. But now, as they beheld his final sacrifice, they understood. Faith was not something that could be killed. A woman, draped in a simple veil, wiped her tears and whispered a prayer. She had heard Peter preach in the streets, had seen him heal the sick and restore hope to the broken. His words had changed her life, and now, even in death, they echoed in her heart. The authorities had thought this execution would send a message, a warning to those who dared to follow the teachings of Christ. But they had underestimated the power of conviction. Peter's death did not silence the movement. It strengthened it. Those who had once been afraid now felt emboldened. If their leader had been willing to face death without fear, how could they do any less? Under the cover of night, a small group of disciples risked their lives to recover Peter's body. They moved carefully through the city, avoiding the eyes of the Roman guards. His remains were taken to a secret location, a humble grave far from the grandeur of Rome's monuments. There, by flickering candlelight, they mourned, prayed, and swore an oath to continue his mission. Little did they know that, centuries later, the place where he was buried would become one of the most revered sites in Christendom. The city that had condemned him would one day bear witness to his legacy. The empire that sought to erase his name would crumble, but his faith would endure. Peter was gone, but his story was far from over. The night air was heavy with the scent of rain, as the small group of believers carefully carried Peter's body through the darkened streets of Rome. Every shadow, every distant footstep sent chills through them. If the Roman guards caught them, they too would share his fate. Yet fear did not stop them. They owed Peter more than silent grief. They owed him a proper burial, a resting place worthy of the man who had given everything for his faith. Among them was Linus, one of Peter's closest disciples. His hands trembled as he helped lower the lifeless body onto a wooden cart. He had listened to Peter's teachings for years, watched him challenge kings and emperors without hesitation. Now he struggled to believe that this was real, that the man who had once stood so strong was now cold and still. "Where shall we take him?" one of the men whispered. Linus hesitated. They could not give him a public burial. Rome would never allow it. And yet they could not leave him to rot in disgrace, exposed to scavengers as criminals often were. "There is a place outside the city," Linus finally said. "A secret place where the faithful gather. We will lay him there." Carefully, they moved through the winding alleys, past the ruins of pagan temples, past the grand structures of an empire that had declared war on their faith. They traveled in silence, their thoughts heavy with grief. The world had lost a man who had walked alongside Christ himself. How could they possibly continue without him? As they reached their destination, a quiet garden hidden behind the home of a wealthy believer, they laid Peter's body on the ground and knelt beside him. No grand ceremony, no official recognition, just a handful of loyal disciples saying farewell to the man who had guided them. "We must not let his death be in vain," a voice murmured. Linus looked up, his eyes reflecting the flickering torchlight. "It won't be," he said. "Peter is gone, but his mission is not. We will carry it forward." One by one, they placed their hands on Peter's body, offering silent prayers. The man who had once been called Simon the fisherman had become the rock upon which their faith stood. He had stumbled, he had failed, but in the end, he had remained unshaken. As they covered his body with earth, sealing his resting place beneath the cold soil, none of them could have imagined what the future would hold. Centuries later, the very ground where they buried him would become the heart of Christendom. A great basilica would rise, built upon the tomb of the man Rome had tried to erase. His name would be spoken in reverence, his legacy written in history. Peter had died, but his voice would never be silenced. The first light of dawn crept over the city of Rome as Peter's disciples finished their work. The earth covering his body was still fresh, untouched by time, yet the weight of his absence already pressed upon them. They had buried their leader, their teacher, their friend. But as they stood in silence, staring at the unmarked grave, they knew this was not the end. Linus, his heart heavy with grief, turned to the others. "Peter would not want us to mourn him as if we had lost hope," he said. His voice, though weary, carried a quiet strength. "His death is not a defeat, it is a testimony. We must be stronger now than ever." The others nodded, but doubt lingered in their eyes. The persecution against them was growing. Nero's hatred for Christians had only intensified, and Peter's execution was meant to be a warning. The message was clear. No one was safe. "What will we do now?" a woman asked, her voice trembling. Linus clenched his fists. "We do as Peter did. We spread the word. We strengthen the faithful. And we do not fear death." But courage was easier spoken than lived. Many among them wondered if their fate would be the same as Peter's. Could they endure the suffering he had endured? Could they face Rome's cruelty without breaking? A deep silence settled over them until another voice spoke. A young man, one of the many who had followed Peter in secret. "They tried to kill the message by killing the man," he said. "But they do not understand. The message does not die. The words hung in the air, settling in the hearts of those gathered. And it was true. Peter was gone, but his teachings, his faith, his unwavering belief in Christ, those things remained. Linus stepped forward, placing his hand over the fresh soil. "This is not just a grave," he murmured. "This is a foundation. One day, the world will know what happened here. One day, they will understand." For now, they had to remain in hiding. The streets of Rome were dangerous, and the empire's fury had not yet been satisfied. More arrests would come, more blood would be spilled. But no matter how fierce the storm, they would not abandon what Peter had built. As the morning sun rose higher, they slipped away one by one, vanishing into the city's shadows. But in their hearts, they carried something that Rome could never destroy, a fire that would continue to burn, spreading beyond the walls of this city, beyond the reach of any emperor. The man called Peter was dead, but his legacy had only just begun. The days following Peter's execution were filled with uncertainty. The Christian community in Rome was in mourning, but they had little time to grieve. Nero's persecution had only just begun, and every follower of Christ was now a hunted man or woman. The streets were no longer safe. Anyone caught speaking the name of Jesus risked being thrown into prison, or worse. Linus and the others moved cautiously, gathering in secret places to pray and to plan. Though their numbers were small, their faith was unshaken. They whispered stories of Peter's final moments, of his courage, of his willingness to suffer for the truth he carried. But the question weighed on all of them. What would happen next? Who would lead them now? One night, in the flickering glow of an oil lamp, the elders of the church met in a hidden chamber beneath a carpenter's shop. The air was thick with silence as they looked to Linus, the one Peter had entrusted with so much before his death. "The people need guidance," one of the elders said. "We cannot scatter like frightened sheep." Linus nodded slowly. He had been close to Peter for years, had learned from him, walked beside him, and witnessed his unshakable devotion. But to take his place? That was something he had never imagined. "I am not Peter," Linus finally said. "I do not have his strength." An older man stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "No one does. There will never be another like him. But Christ did not build his church on one man alone. It was always meant to endure, no matter who stood at its head." Linus lowered his gaze, thinking of the countless believers who now looked to them for leadership. If they faltered, if they allowed fear to consume them, then Peter's sacrifice would have been in vain. After a long silence, he took a deep breath. "Then we continue," he said. "We will not run. We will not hide our faith. Rome thinks it has silenced Peter, but it has only made his voice louder." A murmur of agreement spread through the room. They knew the risks. They knew that one by one they too might face the same fate as Peter. But they also knew that the message of Christ was greater than any one life. Outside, the city of Rome pulsed with its usual rhythm, unaware of the quiet revolution taking place beneath its streets. The rock had fallen, but the foundation remained unshaken. The Christian movement in Rome had lost its greatest leader, but the fire he ignited refused to be extinguished. The days following Peter's execution were filled with fear, yet also with determination. His death had been meant as a warning, a statement of Rome's power, but instead it had become something else, a rallying cry for those who had believed his words. Linus now bore the weight of responsibility. He had walked with Peter, learned from him, and had been chosen to carry on his mission. But was he ready? Could he truly stand in the place of a man who had faced death without fear? He often asked himself these questions as he moved through the hidden places where believers now gathered. The persecution grew fiercer with each passing day. Nero's rage knew no bounds, and Christians were being arrested by the dozens. Some were thrown to wild beasts in the Colosseum. Others were burned alive as torches in the emperor's gardens. The sight of such brutality shook even the strongest among them. Yet, despite the terror, they did not turn away from their faith. One evening, as Linus sat in a dimly lit chamber beneath the home of a widow who had given shelter to believers, an elder approached him. The man's face was weary, his eyes shadowed with sorrow. "They have taken more of our brothers and sisters," the elder whispered. "We do not know how many will survive." Linus clenched his fists. "And yet, we still gather," he said. "We still preach. Rome expects us to fall apart, but we will not." The elder nodded, though the lines of worry remained etched on his face. "But what of those who waver? There are some who, in their fear, have renounced the faith to save their lives. Can we blame them?" Linus closed his eyes. He understood the weight of those words. Many had stood firm, but some had faltered. Could he or anyone judge them for their fear? Even Peter himself had once denied Christ in a moment of weakness, but in the end, he had given everything. "We must remind them," Linus said at last, "that faith is not about never falling. It is about rising again. If Peter could find redemption, so can they." Outside, the city continued as if nothing had changed. The empire still ruled. Its banners still flew, its armies still marched. But beneath the surface, in the hidden corners of Rome, something far greater was unfolding. Peter was gone, but his people remained. His mission remained. And soon, the world would come to see that no empire, no emperor could stop what had begun. The persecution of Christians in Rome reached new levels of cruelty. Nero, in his madness, found twisted pleasure in their suffering. The executions were no longer just punishments, they had become spectacles. The Colosseum roared with the cries of the condemned as wild beasts were unleashed upon them. The streets were lit by the flames of burning believers, their bodies turned into torches for the emperor's gardens. But despite the horror, the faith did not waver. In the hidden corners of the city, in underground tunnels and secret gatherings, the followers of Christ continued to meet. And in their hearts, the memory of Peter burned brighter than ever. Linus had now fully stepped into the role Peter had left behind. The weight of responsibility bore down on him, but he no longer questioned his place. He had seen the courage of those who refused to deny their faith, even in the face of death. He had listened to the whispered prayers of the believers who had lost loved ones, but still clung to the promise of eternity. One night, a young woman approached Linus during one of their secret gatherings. Her face was streaked with tears, her hands trembling. "My brother was taken," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They will throw him to the lions tomorrow." Linus placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, though his own heart ached with the weight of so many losses. Did he renounce his faith? She shook her head. He stood firm. Even when they beat him, even when they told him he could go free if he only denied Christ, he refused. Linus nodded solemnly. He had heard these stories before. They were the stories of men and women who had found something greater than life itself, an unshakable belief that death was not the end. "Then, your brother has already won," he said softly. Tears welled in the young woman's eyes, but she did not argue. She understood, even through her pain. The world saw death as the final defeat, but for those who believed as Peter had, death was only a door. Linus stood before the gathered believers, looking at their faces, some young, some old, all carrying the scars of the trials they had endured. He knew that they were all in danger. Any day, at any moment, The Roman guards could break down the doors and drag them away. But he also knew something else. Rome believed that by killing Peter, they had crushed the movement he had led. But they had done the opposite. The blood of the martyrs was not extinguishing the faith, it was fueling it. "Peter is gone," Linus said, his voice firm, "but his message remains. We are not alone. We do not fear what is to come, for we know that the kingdom of God is greater than the empire of men." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. They were no longer just hiding, they were preparing. And though Peter's body lay beneath the Roman soil, his spirit lived on in each of them. The weight of Peter's sacrifice continued to shape the underground church in Rome. His followers no longer saw themselves as helpless victims, but as bearers of a truth too powerful to be erased. They met in the catacombs beneath the city, whispering prayers and sharing bread as they honored the memory of their fallen leader. Each gathering was a risk. Each word, spoken in faith, a challenge to the empire that sought to silence them. Linus watched over them with quiet determination. He had once doubted his own strength, questioned whether he could carry the mantle left by Peter. But now, as he looked into the eyes of those who depended on him, he understood. This was not a burden, but a calling. One night, as he sat in deep thought, a messenger arrived, breathless and shaken. "The guards are searching for you," the young man whispered. "They know you are Peter's successor." Linus felt a chill, but he did not flinch. He had known this day would come. Rome would not allow a movement to survive without its leaders. If they had crucified Peter, they would not hesitate to do the same to him. "What do you want to do?" another believer asked. "Should we move you to a safer place?" Linus shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "We do not run. If they take me, then let it be. But until that moment, we continue." The men around him exchanged worried glances. They admired Linus's courage, but they also knew what happened to those who defied Rome. That night, the believers gathered once more, hidden beneath the streets in the dim glow of oil lamps. A hush fell over them as Linus stood and spoke. "We are not afraid," he declared. "Peter did not fear death, and neither shall we. Rome believes it can destroy us with fear, but they do not understand. We have seen what they cannot see. We know the truth that they deny." A murmur of agreement passed through the room. These were not the same people they had been before Peter's death. They had been transformed, just as Peter had been transformed from a simple fisherman into the rock upon which Christ built his church. Linus took a deep breath and continued. "One day, this city will no longer belong to Nero. One day, the name of Christ will be spoken not in secret, but in the open streets. One day, Rome will bow before the very faith it now seeks to destroy." It was a bold claim, almost impossible to believe in that moment. But Linus knew the truth. No empire, no ruler, no force on earth could stop what had begun. As the believers left that night, slipping into the shadows to avoid the eyes of the guards, Linus remained behind, staring at the faint glow of a single flickering flame. Peter's journey had ended, but the fire he had lit was only beginning to spread. The streets of Rome remained hostile, the empire relentless in its pursuit of those who followed the teachings of Christ. Yet, despite the cruelty, despite the blood that had been spilled, the message Peter carried had not died with him. If anything, it had grown stronger. Linus moved carefully through the city, knowing that at any moment he could be captured. The guards were searching for him, their orders clear: eliminate the man who had taken Peter's place. But Linus was not afraid. He had accepted his fate long before this day had come. He had seen what Peter had seen, felt what Peter had felt. Death was not the end. As he walked through the narrow alleys, he passed a group of Roman citizens gathered around a merchant's stall. Whispers spread among them, hushed voices speaking of strange occurrences. "They say, even as he hung upside down, he did not scream in pain," one man murmured. "They say he prayed." A woman nearby shook her head. "They say his followers still gather, still speak of him as if he were alive." Linus did not stop, but he listened. The seed Peter had planted was growing, even in the hearts of those who had once mocked him. That night, deep in the catacombs beneath the city, the believers gathered once more. Linus stood among them, his voice steady as he spoke. Peter did not live for himself, and he did not die for himself. He lived and died for Christ, and now, so must we. A silence followed his words. There was no need for further explanation. They all understood what was at stake. As the night deepened, Linus sat in quiet reflection. He thought of Peter, not as the great apostle or the fearless leader, but as the man he had once been, the fisherman from Galilee, the man who had stumbled, who had doubted, who had failed, and yet in the end, he had become something greater. Peter had once asked Jesus, "Lord, where are you going?" And now Linus understood the answer. Peter had followed Christ, even unto death, and soon others would follow as well. The world believed that Peter's death was the end of his story, but in truth, it was only the beginning. The church he had built, the faith he had carried would spread far beyond Rome, beyond the reach of emperors and the might of legions. Someday, the empire that had killed him would no longer stand, but the kingdom he had preached about would last forever. The empire of Rome had crushed many rebellions, silenced countless voices, and erased the names of those who dared to defy its power. Yet, something about Peter's death unsettled the rulers. His execution was meant to be a warning, but instead, it had ignited something unstoppable. In the years that followed, Peter's grave remained a secret, known only to a few of his closest followers. Linus and the others ensured that his resting place was undisturbed. But even in death, Peter continued to challenge Rome. Rumors began to spread. Some said that miracles had occurred near the site of his burial. Others claimed that those who prayed in his name found the strength to endure suffering. The very empire that had condemned him now found itself haunted by his legacy. Despite Nero's continued persecution, the Christian faith grew. Rome had expected fear to scatter the believers, but instead, it bound them closer together. The stories of Peter's teachings, his miracles, and ultimately his sacrifice were carried beyond the walls of the city, reaching new lands and new hearts. One evening, Linus sat in the dim glow of an oil lamp, writing on a parchment. His hand moved steadily, crafting a letter meant for distant believers who had never met Peter but had heard of his faith. To my brothers and sisters in the faith, our teacher, our guide, our beloved Peter, has left this world, but do not weep as those who have no hope. For though his body may rest beneath the earth, his spirit is alive in every one of us who carries the truth he preached. Do not fear the trials ahead, for Peter himself once feared, and yet he overcame. Stand firm, as he stood firm, and know that no empire, no sword, and no fire can extinguish the light of Christ. The road before us is hard, but the reward is beyond what this world can offer. We do not stand alone. The same Lord who called Peter calls us still. And as Peter followed him, so too must we. Linus rolled up the parchment, sealing it with wax. This letter, along with many others, would be carried in secret, reaching Christian communities throughout the empire. Peter's voice had not been silenced. It had multiplied. Outside, the city of Rome burned with the ambitions of emperors. its streets filled with soldiers and merchants, senators and slaves. It was a city of power, of wealth, of cruelty. But beneath its foundations, hidden from the eyes of the rulers, something far greater was being built. The rock upon which Christ had built his church had fallen, but the church itself was rising. The Christian faith was no longer just a movement whispered in the alleys of Rome. It was spreading like wildfire. Despite the brutality of Nero's persecution, despite the bloodshed, the name of Christ was being spoken in places where it had never been heard before. And at the heart of this growing faith was Peter's legacy. Linus and the other leaders knew they could not openly reveal Peter's burial site. If the Romans discovered it, they would desecrate his grave, hoping to erase his memory from history. But the believers refused to forget. The rock upon which Jesus had built his church had fallen, but his foundation remained firm. One evening, Linus and a small group of disciples gathered in the catacombs beneath Rome. By the dim light of torches, they stood before a simple stone marker, one that bore no name, no inscription, yet was sacred to those who knew the truth. A young man, new to the faith, knelt before the marker. "Will they ever know?" he asked. "Will the world ever hear what Peter did?" Linus placed a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. "They will," he said, "but not in the way Rome expects. They think that by killing us, they are winning, but every life they take only strengthens what Peter built. One day, they will realize that they have fought against something they cannot destroy." The young man nodded, but doubt still lingered in his eyes. "The Emperor rules everything," he said. "His legions march across the world. How can we ever stand against such power?" Linus smiled, recalling the words Peter himself had spoken years ago. "Do you remember what our Lord told Peter?" he asked. "The gates of hell shall not prevail against it." The young man's expression shifted as understanding dawned on him. "The kingdom of Rome will fall," Linus continued. "One day, its statues will crumble, its palaces will turn to dust. But the kingdom that Peter spoke of, the kingdom of God, will never end." The others nodded in agreement. They knew the dangers ahead. More of them would be arrested, tortured, executed. But they also knew something that Rome did not. They were not merely fighting to survive. They were fighting for something eternal. As the torches flickered and the shadows danced on the stone walls, the believers bowed their heads in prayer. They prayed for strength, for wisdom, for the courage to stand firm in the face of persecution. And they prayed that one day the world would see what Peter had seen, the truth that was worth dying for. Above them, the city of Rome continued as if nothing had changed. But beneath its streets, in the darkness of the catacombs, history was being written. Peter was gone, but his mission lived on. Years passed, but the memory of Peter did not fade. The empire that had crucified him continued its persecution, believing that with enough force, it could stamp out the growing movement of Christ's followers. But Rome was blind to the truth. Faith was not built on the strength of armies or the will of emperors. It was built on something far greater. Linus, now an older man, stood before a gathering of believers in a hidden chamber beneath the city. The faces before him were young and old, rich and poor, slaves and free men, all drawn together by the same message, the same hope. They had lost many to the wrath of the empire, but they had also gained more than they had ever imagined. "Do you see?" Linus said, his voice strong despite his age. "They killed Peter to silence him. Yet here we are more than before, speaking his words, living his faith. Rome cannot defeat what it does not understand." The believers listened with unwavering attention. Among them sat a young woman, her hands clenched tightly around a small wooden cross. Her father had been taken by the soldiers days before, accused of following the Christian faith. She had not seen him since. She raised her voice, hesitant but determined. "They take our leaders, they take our families. How can we endure this? How can we carry on when we know we may be next?" Linus walked toward her, kneeling so that their eyes met. "Peter asked the same question once," he said gently. "The night they took Jesus, he was afraid. He ran. He denied knowing him. But that was not the end of his story. Do you know why?" The young woman shook her head, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Because he chose to rise again," Linus continued. "Faith is not about never falling. It is about standing up, even when the world tries to keep you down. Peter was afraid, just as we are. But in the end, he embraced his calling. He stood firm, even in death. And because he did, we are here now." Tears welled in the young woman's eyes, but there was no longer fear, only resolve. Linus stood again, turning to address the rest of the gathering. "This is not the end. This is only the beginning. Peter is gone, but his mission is alive. And as long as we stand together, as long as we hold to the truth he gave us, nothing, not Nero, not Rome, not death itself, can defeat us." A murmur of agreement spread through the room, growing louder, stronger. They were no longer just a scattered group of survivors. They were something far greater. The faith of Peter had not died with him. It had only begun to rise. Time marched forward, and Rome remained as powerful as ever, its legions stretching across distant lands, its rulers believing themselves to be gods. Yet beneath the grand temples and towering palaces, something was changing. The faith that Peter had carried, the faith that Rome had tried to crush, was growing stronger with each passing day. Linus, now frail with age, stood in the dim light of a small underground gathering. He had lived through the darkest days of persecution, watched as brothers and sisters were dragged to their deaths. And yet, he had also witnessed something miraculous: faith that refused to die. A young man stepped forward, his eyes filled with conviction. "You have carried Peter's mission for so long," he said. "What will happen when you are gone?" Linus smiled faintly. The lines on his face deepened by years of struggle. "The same thing that happened when Peter was taken," he said. "The mission will continue. It does not belong to one man. It never did." He gestured around the room, to the men and women who had given their lives to something greater than themselves. "Look around you. This is what Peter built. Not a city, not a kingdom of stone, but a people. A people who will endure long after Rome has fallen." The young man nodded, understanding the weight of those words. Linus took a deep breath and continued. "Peter's death was not the end of his story, and when my time comes, it will not be the end of mine. Each of us carries the truth, and as long as we do, Rome will never truly win." Silence settled over the gathering as they absorbed his words. They had lost many, suffered greatly, but the message remained unbroken. Above them, in the streets of Rome, statues of emperors stood tall, their names carved into stone as a testament to their rule. But what none of them knew was that those names, those rulers, would one day be forgotten. But Peter's name would never fade. His execution had been meant to end his influence, yet centuries later, the very place where he had been buried would become the heart of Christendom. The empire that had condemned him would crumble, but his faith would rise beyond its ruins. Linus knew he would not live to see that day, but it did not matter. The kingdom Peter had preached about was not of this world. It did not rely on power, on armies, or on rulers. It lived in the hearts of those who believed. As Linus closed his eyes, he whispered a final prayer, not for himself, but for those who would come after him. And in that moment, he knew the truth. Peter had died, but his mission had not, and it never would. This was Chapter 1 of our 12-part series on how the apostles of Jesus died. If you found this story impactful, like this video, subscribe and share it with others who would be interested in biblical history. Don't stop here. Watch Chapter 2, where we uncover the fate of Andrew, Peter's brother, and his tragic end. The journey is just beginning.